Okay, so I definitely want to acknowledge a couple of my extension colleagues here, Martin Manguel, Victor Malaco. I'm basically going to talk about an extension program that we fired up with some state funding in the last year and a half, and these guys have probably put in more time on it than me now, but I think it's opened my eyes on some things that I hope I can share with you guys and provide some insights that are probably relevant on a lot of farms. So I'll talk about this, what we're calling just a feeding program assessment. It's a little different than some of what's common out there that companies do, but we've certainly borrowed from their insights as well. Share some of the key insights that we learned, at least on Michigan dairies. What are we seeing that people are not doing perfectly? What are going well? What things are going well? Talk about some management tweaks, not just in like day-to-day how to do these things, but also how to manage the system sort of. And then just kind of things that I think can be taken home to a lot of farms. Okay. So you guys have heard this, right? So especially the students in here, there's 3 diets on a farm, right? What have you heard this before? There's the diet on paper. I know you've heard this. There's the diet that's mixed, right? And then there's the diet the cow actually eats. And it's, of course, one of the overall goals of the feeding program to make those 3 as closely aligned as possible, right? But it's never going to be perfect. And so a lot goes into this, right? And then particularly if you start scaling up farms bigger and bigger and bigger, just the logistics starts to get mind-boggling. There's a farm going in Texas right now that's going to milk 60 to 80,000 cows. I can't wait to see the logistics of moving feed in there in the coming year or two. But so, you know, a lot to go into here, and part of this is keeping people safe in the process, right? With huge equipment moving around at high rates of speed in some cases, making sure we're processing feeds appropriately so it's actually digestible once a cow consumes it. And then, of course, trying to get every cow, ideally every mouthful for every cow, to be as spot on, consistent as we possibly can. Because it's not exactly true, but more or less it's true that the rumen likes consistency, right? So they can handle some variability, but the more consistent we can be, generally the better off we're going to be. So what if not all of that works perfectly, right? If we have some gaps in here, some disconnects, some poor planning, we can easily end up with a lot of wasted time. We can end up with safety risks. One thing I'll highlight a lot is shrink, wasted feed resources, right? We can have environmental problems, either from poorly mixed, poorly formulated diets, or just leachate, for example, going into waterways. And then ultimately, what's most impactful probably for the bottom line of the dairy is if we do all this poorly, we're not going to get high milk yields and we're going to have more health problems, right? So those are all things we want to avoid. Okay, so it's a very negative way of saying all this. Let this fire up again here. So anyway, the overall project, I can start talking through it and show you a few pictures, but basically we got some funding and some basically to pay for some time to put together an on-farm assessment that's meant to cover that entire process I just showed in the last. So it's a little bit different than what some entities do, in that we're not necessarily focusing super deep on one section. We don't go as in depth, for example, on equipment as like what Diamond B does, but we try to cover that whole spectrum we basically would spend 10 to 12 man hours with a couple people going there for a good half a day or more to look at 120 specific factors that we wanted to consider as part of the program. And now I've probably messed this up somehow. There we go. So we came up with a standardized 1 to 5 scale for each of these 120 items that we wanted to look at. And I'm not going to even come close to going through all of those, but it includes a lot of things you might guess, like how good is silage face management? Do they have good cover on the silage pile? Do they have obvious evidence of rodents or other hygiene issues in their feed storage? All kinds of things like that. And then we'd group them into these 6 areas of focus to allow us to communicate or to try to summarize things into Because, you could go on a farm and say, well, out of these 120 items, you were not perfect in 104 of them. So you got, obviously, that's the last thing you would do to actually affect any change, because people will just glaze over and go about their day, right? So you have to figure out what are the 3 to 5 most important things that somebody really should focus on, and then you can start working down the list, right? So this is how we decided to approach it. We broke them into these 6 categories. Just general mixing, how well is your equipment doing? Are you putting a TMR together properly to get good mixing? Hygiene, that's really about, are you seeing a lot of mold, or do you have a lot of birds pooping on your feed, things like that. Production is kind of a catch-all, but this is things that are going to affect whether cows are able to make milk. So if they're running out of feed, I'll talk about that a little bit. That's where we would ding you there. Safety, kind of self-explanatory. Shrink, we used a number of ways to assess this. One of the most disappointing things I learned, even on very large dairies, is what a tiny fraction of dairies do even a halfway okay job of tracking feed inventories and losses. And that's, to me, like a personal mission the next 10 years. And at least in Michigan, we're going to get better at that. And then just overall efficiency, and some of that's even just simple routing. Like if UPS was to figure out how best to move feed around your farm, how would they design it, right? So that sort of thing. So then we'd use those and say, what was the perfect score in these categories and what was yours, and the category with the biggest gaps, we'd call it improvement potential. It's a positive way to say it, right? So this is the category where you were the farthest from 100%. So we're going to focus on that. Okay. So in our evaluations, when we come back to the farm and give the feedback to the manager, we'd start with safety concerns, bring them up first, especially if there were any like serious ones. We did see one employee on a dairy on top of a probably 25-foot tall silage pile about this far from the edge, and they were like, "Is that this guy?" And we're like, "Yeah." And they're like, "We've talked to him like 5 times. He won't listen." And so those are problems. And then we kind of highlight what are things you can do in the next month, and then what are things you might want to consider for longer term, like if there's a substantial capital investment. So I'll give you some examples of each of these types of things. So just to give you, this is a little bit outdated. I think we've done like 15 farms now, anywhere from 180 to 3,500 cows. And I haven't been involved in all of them, but probably half of them I have. And lots of different feeding systems. So it's been interesting. And I feel like we've kind of been able to mature the assessment this way by seeing some things we've missed, in different systems where, we should add this to the assessment. So this is a little bit out of date, but I think this is after we had the first 8 or 10 farms done, and we just mapped out how our evaluation scoring system looked on these different 6 areas. So it's kind of interesting to look at. These first farms we evaluated, we gave them scores anywhere from about 70 to about 90. So not a huge range there, but the areas that they needed to emphasize, you can see from the different colors, really did vary quite a bit by farm. So for one, in terms of efficiency, it's maybe not too surprising. People value their time on farms. For the most part, they've figured out pretty good ways to get feed mixed and delivered. And that's basically time and equipment efficiency. And we thought most farms didn't have a whole lot to improve on there, maybe a few points here and there. A wide range of what we thought the farm was doing in terms of shrink. And you can see we gave one farm a score of something like 60. And I'll give you a couple pictures that maybe take a couple points home. Others did an excellent job. And particularly in the last couple of years, as feed prices have risen so dramatically, in terms of the economics of a dairy, this is becoming more and more important. And so something we really tried to point out to people and at least start measuring it, even if you can't make huge changes right now. Safety, you can see on average, these farms didn't score real great there. So with 70, and some of this we're being super picky. Okay, so we're, you don't have a slow moving vehicle sign on the back of your feed wagon, but it never goes on the road. Okay, is that horribly important? Maybe not, but we're trying to say, let's set the bar high and at least give you things to think about. All right, so I'm going to talk through some of those. Any questions on any of that? Like, do you get a rough sense of what we're throwing in those buckets? Or okay.
What's in the production bucket?
Yeah, it is a little bit of a catch-all. So definitely, like, is feed available? Are you like so overstocked that there's no bunk space? Do you have decent water availability? Is just like the feeding area reasonably good? So for example, if your concrete at the feed bunk is so broken up and degraded that it's hard for them to actually eat. So those are all the things that we think would affect intake or the ability of cows to sort of eat at least when they want to, that sort of thing. Push-ups go in there.
Efficiency is just time efficiency?
Pretty much, yes. So we didn't like, that's not like feed efficiency or shrink or anything. We put those in separate buckets. So it's efficiency of processes, I would say. So there's a few cases there where we'd highlight people, for example, on these huge farms, they've got really big silage pads. And so sometimes you end up going a quarter mile, maybe I'm exaggerating a little, but quite a ways to get the silage and bring it back. And so a few times we'd be like, well, it'd be a lot smarter if you just took the TMR wagon and filled all the silage and brought it back in one fell swoop and made a pile here, things like that, thinking about minimizing the back and forth 100 times. Okay, so when I sat there and tried to distill what I thought were the key takeaways from a general sense, not for a specific farm, but what did we learn by doing this about what farms are doing well or not? I would say at least the farms we looked at, I wouldn't say that the big farms are necessarily doing things better. Some are doing an excellent job, some are not, to be frank. And the same is true with smaller farms. And it's interesting, the 200 cow operations, typically the owner is doing the feeding, and they're typically very educated, very conscientious, but also scatterbrained because they are juggling 15 jobs, right? And so there's trade-offs there. And there's things where like, well, I'd love to do this better, but I just can't afford that time, which is a real challenge. I'll give you some examples of what I mean by this, but typically, what I think I saw on these farms is you could tell where people were focused on doing a good job. So, for example, it's funny how this happens, but you always hear if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, right? And so that's true, and it's good to measure things, but then it's very clear that that drives a lot of the focus, and that's good. But there's other things that are harder to track, like on software, and then they don't get the focus. So for example, I'll show you some data of, on average, these farms, people mixing diets are hitting their targets in terms of weights of ingredients within 1 or 2%, almost all the time. It was super impressive, and you can tell people are tracking that and actually either using a carrot or a stick of some kind, at least verbal, good job, you're hitting your targets, because it was impressive. People that have Easy Feed or some software, you can tell that's being watched. There are other things that are not being tracked by software, and they're maybe just as important or more, and it's not being, anywhere near that level of focus. Okay, so that's good to think about. And then at a high level, the management should be deciding what should be our priorities, what are our KPIs for our feeding program specifically, key performance indicators. And then we need to build systems to track that or somehow keep track of it, even if it's just through WhatsApp or something, okay? Lots of variability. I can't really show this so much, but it was real clear. Part of what we're doing, the two colleagues I'm working with both speak Spanish much better than I do. So we're kind of interviewing feeders, most of them Spanish speaking, and sort of asking them a set of just sort of basic questions about, do you know why we're doing, kind of like you're talking about before. It's like, it's really important that people know why they should do this. Like, why is it important not to just finish dumping the bucket of a feed after the light goes off because you don't want to take the rest back to the pile, right? It's not just because your boss is annoying, it's because that actually changes what you're feeding the animal and that affects their productivity, right? So there's a lot of variability. There's people that were awesome, amazing. They've been doing it for 20 years. They know the ins and outs. And other people that had, well, when we came, we'd been there for 2 months and they had no training except how to drive the tractor. And it's kind of like learn on the job from there. So opportunities there for sure. And then I'll spend more time talking about shrink, like I said already. All right. So again, just to bring up this highlight, safety is kind of like, it's not that hard to do it right. Some things it is, it can be tricky uncovering piles when you have these super huge silage piles, but thinking about how to do it the right way and not the wrong way is important. And simple things like just keep the PTOs shafts covered. Some of these bigger farms, again, these end loaders are massive. They're flying around 25, 30 miles an hour. Usually there's no people around, but one thing I learned from some of the people I was working with on this project is, I grew up on a farm, tractors everywhere. I didn't have a lot of fear. It's like, no, you don't go out at 5 a.m. in the dark and stand there and watch them. You're like, do not get out of your car. You drive your car around where you want to watch and you stay in your car. So it's like, oh, okay. It's actually smart. But some of those operations, if there's a feed center, having some mirrors around the corners and stuff like that can prevent something, disastrous. Anyway, so we usually had a few of these things to point out. And some of the bigger farms, often they'll have a policy of wearing high-vis clothes or vests or whatever. The compliance in our experience was quite poor. Very few people. So the best I've seen is, I like it, a lot of bigger dairies will just have like standard uniforms they give to employees. Just make them bright orange. Like instead of having a green farm polo that everybody wears, make it a bright orange one or a bright neon green one or something, and then people will comply. I already kind of mentioned this, but there are a couple things that people tend to watch on Easy Feed or other software, and it's maybe not this as much as the accuracy, but people one way or another typically do kind of keep track. And this was one of the best farms, but generally people did a really good job of delivering feed at the right time. So one thing that I think is weird about Easy Feed, this is like backwards in the way my mind thinks anyway. So this is midnight going through the morning up till the end of the night, right? So if you look going upwards, you can see the first feeds hitting at all these different pens on this farm, and they're just really, really tight. Now, part of the way they do it on this farm is they make one big batch and they give a small amount to like 10 pens at once, so that there's some feed in front of these cows at the right time. And that's partly why they're so consistent. But again, they designed the plan around that to make sure that cows have something in front of them at the same time every day. They did a pretty good job. So there's a couple days where it's a little off, but by and large, pretty impressive. And yeah, when we use cameras, we see some variability. Some farms are worse than others, but by and large, if people are watching something, it gets done pretty consistently on most farms. But then when there's lapses, the impacts on profitability can be pretty astounding sometimes. So I think I masked all the farm-specific info here. So this is from a farm where I just mentioned that a guy had just gotten hired in this role a couple months ago. He had no experience feeding before. They had tried to train him to some extent, but they're stretched pretty thin already, and I don't think they would say they did a great job. This was really interesting because typically the stories you hear are, a farm has a great feeder, they get a day off or a couple days off every other weekend or something. And so you'll see 10 days in a row of just fantastically, or 12 days of fantastically consistent feeding right on. And then you'll have 2 days where it's pretty, erratic. This is actually the opposite. So the major feeder here was overshooting over 2 weeks by 9%. So that's 60,000 pounds of extra feed spread out on this farm over a 2-week period. That's a lot of feed. And the extra person that fills in when that person's gone was like spot on. They were within 1% of the targeted deliveries. So it's like, wow, okay. So it's kind of a backward situation. And then when we dug into the ingredients, the one that stuck out the most is soybean meal, 33% over target over, again, a 2-week period. So just that one ingredient was about $7,000 a month of just overfeeding. And then, yeah, if you want to take it further, okay, so this is probably protein getting wasted, right? Because you're feeding it to animals in excess of requirements. So you're just adding nitrogen to your manure. And in theory, you should be adding, spreading over more acres. Lots of compounding things you can point to here. And ultimately, it comes down to somebody that's not well trained, right? And so it's one thing to say, we can't spare somebody to train this person, but I mean, pay somebody to come from MSU as an undergrad, through, pay them $1,000. You've paid for that in a week, right? I mean, I don't know, find a solution. That's kind of, one way to think about it. So it's easy, it's easy for me to say that for sure. I understand, but I love to try to throw numbers in front of people, come as close as I can to the real cost, because then you can scale it against, well, we have this solution, but it's expensive. Is it really compared to this? No, it's probably not. So one of the key things I was kind of alluding to, and I said, it's great to have software and it helps you focus on certain things, but it doesn't necessarily always get you focused on the most important things. I don't know if this is the most important, but there's no standard software that all farms use to keep track of equipment maintenance. And it's not that hard to build a spreadsheet, right? To say like, okay, we're going to do this once a month, have it populate a calendar for somebody on the farm, to do X once a month, but it doesn't get done in many cases. This is kind of hilarious how bad it was. This farm, they actually had a haylage bag that somebody had, I don't know if it was on accident or what, but they had actually ripped open like a month's worth of silage. Like the bag was ripped open that far. I was like, and then it seemed like half the plastic was actually inside the wagon too. So it's like, this is not good for the longevity of your equipment. It's not good for actually having the equipment do its job of mixing feed well, right? And then obviously you're going to be getting tons of these shreds in the feed in front of the cows, which probably not going to kill any cows, but it's also not wonderful, right? And it certainly doesn't make your farm look impressive if somebody's coming by, right? So even just that, let's try to keep, plastic bags out of your mixer. And then it gets to the more complex things like there's a lot of pieces inside a TMR wagon that if you're not an expert on, it's easy to overlook. Like, are you getting pitting on the edge of brain isn't even working. Anyway, the siding of the inside of that can start to get corroded and pitted, and that has effects on how well you're mixing. And clean out, in fact, these kind of wagons, if you don't know how to operate it, you got to really rev up the RPMs when you're cleaning out that wagon. And you're like, well, does that really matter? Well, if you're feeding the exact same load over and over, and it's like carryover in your scales accounting for it, it doesn't matter that much, but it can matter, right? If you're feeding dry cows with a decad diet, right before lactating cows, and you don't want to be wasting anionic salts and stuff. So, yeah. Anyway, so that's a big part of the system that many farms, I wouldn't say, do a good job on. This is an advantage, I would say, for the bigger farms, because often they'll have just a person that's running the shop, and it's kind of just their job to keep equipment going, and that does make it easier than it is for a smaller farm. Did I go too far away from this? Or? Okay. So one thing, if you're a dairy nutritionist, one thing that you're used to thinking about is feed buck management and getting animals to the bunk. And so there's some standard rules of thumb here that I think are pretty spot on. So 22, maybe even 24 inches of bunk space per cow. Ideally, she has to be able to eat for 3 to 5 hours a day. Typically, I see that split up into closer to 8 or 10 meals a day. And of course, ideally she's not having to wait for 45 minutes to get access to the bunk, because she might just give up, like you were talking about, Andre. So, and you could debate the effects of this, like if you do 20 push-ups a day, I don't think most cows are going to come to the bunk every single time, right? There's a diminishing returns at some point, but there is pretty good evidence that just somebody going by and messing with the feed will stimulate some cows to come to the bunk. And so we're trying to drive intake, because that tends to drive milk production. That can help us with profitability in terms of just getting more milk, okay? But what I really see that, again, this gave me some insights doing this project. I'm not used to this in a research environment, right? We're feeding cows. Typically, when we're doing research, we want to know how is our diet affecting dry matter intake, which means we got to make sure cows don't run out, which means we feed at least for 10% over. And I understand why some farms don't want to do that. One big change in the last decade on farms is a lot more farms are getting specialized. So, 50 years ago, we were specializing for multiple species and crops to like one core species. And now we're seeing the dairy industry specialize from, we have dairy cattle to, we only have lactating dairy cattle. We don't raise calves. We freshen all our cows over at this other unit. So we're getting more and more. And what that means is it used to be that if people had 5 to 10% leftover feed, you've got some steers out back you could feed it to, or at least you're raising heifers. And people don't have those in many cases anymore. And so it makes them more and more interested in trying to minimize this leftover feed, right? So is that smart? Well, I think it can be done. My take personally is that you can do that very well, but it takes really excellent management. And I'll show you some gaps we found on some farms where I think, again, if you're just flying over as a manager, sort of walking through the barns quick once a day, not watching things carefully, on paper, this could look great. And you're like, why are my cows only at 85 pounds of milk and my neighbor's getting 100? And I think this is part of it. So, and here's where we use cameras as part of our assessment too. We put them up for a week before we go or after, depending on timing. And that data was really valuable. So let me show you one example. So this is from a farm where we had, I think, 5 days of 24-hour camera data. And these are pictures from, I think this was the high pen, if I'm remembering right, at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., and 2 a.m., 3 days in a row. So we saw the first day, we're like, whew, okay, they're out, and they're not feeding till like 7:30 a.m. So that's, in this case, 6.5 hours before they're going to get fed again. They're totally out, and there's cows clearly coming up. It's not like, the data you showed, Andre, yeah, cows don't eat as much in the middle of the night for sure, but these cows are coming back from milking on this farm at like midnight. They're just getting back here, and so a lot of cows are wanting to eat, and there is nothing there. So we saw day 2, same story. Day 3, same stories. We're like, oh, this is an issue. So we bring this to the